Real pleasure to be here. I think we have an exciting couple of individuals here. I come from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We have a new concepts incubator. We work with the 7 DOT Smart City finalists on the nexus of energy and mobility with a very human-centered focus. I think both Brad and Karina bring unique perspectives. We might have some friction, some agreement, and I think a fun discussion here. So thank you both for joining today. And I think where I'd like to start is sort of this, I think, understanding of cities for all, services for all. What are some of the big problems that you see that we can bring some of this technology to improve services, to address the values of citizens, and what's happening on the ground in your neck of the woods? So Brad, we'll start with you.
So I'm Brad Sturtz from Head of Government Affairs for Audi in Washington, D.C. So I'm glad to be part of this and glad to be with my co-panelist here. Because one of the big challenges that we faced in this technology moving towards self-driving vehicles, automated vehicles, is really understanding the problems and how what the effects are when the rubber literally hits the road. And we sort of talk about this at 30,000-foot levels, even into Congress. But when it comes right down to it, how this plays out in communities is what matters. So since you all have some of your sugar balances back in order, I'm going to add more numbers to your diet here today. But I'm only torturing these numbers because I think it's important to understand that the premise for pursuing automated vehicles is pretty simple. It's providing greater access to people who are going to lack it. It's obviously the first order of business is the safety equation. And it's opening up new economic opportunities that are ahead. So just a few stunning numbers in my last year or so of working on this. So 5.7 billion, that's the amount of square meters of parking that will be saved by self-driving vehicles by some estimates. That's the equivalent of half of the state of Connecticut by 2035. So obviously we've been talking about parking and different civic impacts. That's one big opportunity for cities to kind of rethink the dynamic that's been going on for the past 100 years. Another important, impressive number for me that I think is often overlooked, 10,000 baby boomers a day are retiring, which is a big number in and of itself, but when you start compounding that and realizing that half of the states in the US require older drivers to go back in and make sure they can still see or they're still capable of driving, you're going to have an entire wave of people who are still quite capable, but somehow are decertified from driving, and they're going to be stuck. Many of the people are retiring in place in the homes they've lived in for many years and won't want to move. So this is a generational wave that self-driving cars could help solve by getting people when they're sort of stranded in transit deserts. Speaking of transit deserts, I think I saw a number of 45% of Americans don't have access to really convenient and reliable transit. So we've talked a lot about what cities can do around their transit systems, but when you look at the whole country, and of course a lot of that's in the central part of the nation, transit's still a real problem. 45 is also the percentage of blind people who live alone because they don't have any family members and they're kind of isolated in their homes. They can't get out and get a job. And the number that really stood out when the federal government passed its AV policy last year, talking to the advocacy groups, only 37% of blind people have a job, full-time job, or a relatively meaningful job because it's just simply so difficult for them to get out and find an appropriate workplace. And then the last number before I turn it over to Karina that's stunning to think about too is just since we've been talking here this morning and this afternoon, today at this conference, 7 Americans have died in intersections due to crashes. And it's 7 a day, every day, that are dying. I think 25% of fatalities in the country caused by traffic are at intersections, which is sort of the most fundamental building block of the things you work on.
Right. So we were talking behind the curtain about the fact that about 95% of those crashes that occur are the result of human error. And what an extraordinarily bad idea it is to have a human being operating a piece of metal of 1,200 pounds operating at 70 miles an hour and putting some kind of distracting device in their hand and think that everything's going to turn out okay. So, you know, from the city perspective, and I think for many cities, looking toward these three revolutions, looking toward shared autonomous electric vehicles is something that really is something that we think can help improve safety, improve efficiency, and really benefit our cities, but only if we do it sort of in the right way, in a way that solves some of the critical issues that we have. And as Brad was saying, it really is looking at what problem is it do we think that this kind of technology, that these revolutions could help solve. So I'm the director of a new department in the city of Pittsburgh. It's called the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. It's basically a Department of Transportation, but I like that the name is really more about mobility. Because when you go and look up what mobility means in the dictionary, it means the ability to move freely and easily from one place to another, but it also has a second meaning, and that's to be able to change one's economic status or social position. And so it's about social mobility and economic mobility as well as it is for transportation mobility. And we know that the options that one has for commuting is the single largest factor in economic success of households and families. So really looking at these three revolutions, looking at how we can deploy them to that, getting very real about who we're trying to serve. So, you know, we talk and go to bus stops and to other places and meet individuals and meet the ex-offender who actually is prohibited from holding his driver's license. So he's bound by taking mass transit options that get him to work 3 minutes late, 7 minutes late on various occasions, and he loses his job or is prohibited from advancing, and his economic status won't change. Or the single mother who has 2 children that are in subsidized daycare, and the daycare is in the outbound direction on the transit line, but all of the jobs that she can take are in the inbound direction. So these are some of the very real life stories that we hope that autonomous vehicle technology, that shared electric technology can do for us. So in Pittsburgh, some of the things that we're working on now to advance this are working with our industry partners and really looking at things that we call a social compact. How do we get into this together? What are those shared outcomes that we're all working on together? We're looking at rolling out in the next few weeks an RFP for our streetlight conversion so that we can actually convert all of the 70,000 streetlights that we have throughout the city to be not only more energy efficient, but also be platforms for communications and sensing and other kinds of investments there. We're looking at ways to revise our signals. So we were one of the smart signals, and we were fortunate to receive an award from the federal government to implement smart signal technology so that we have a range of detection information now happening, that these are adaptive signal controls. We can now be more dynamic in the way that we're managing our system. Again, we can get this rich information from video detection or other detection technologies that tell us not only what are the queues of vehicles and bicyclists and buses and pedestrians that are coming to these intersections, but actually what are their desire lines? Where do they want to turn? We can finally get information on the close calls to understand how we react at these intersections so that we can have fewer crashes. So we also were asked to talk about sort of what is the insight, what's the secret that maybe we don't want anyone to know about this? And one of the secrets I think I can say for Pittsburgh is that a lot of this is happening in cities, and in some respects is happening to cities, but is not necessarily happening with cities or because of cities. And these are things that we really need to find ways to work more closely together, find ways to kind of press toward those common outcomes, and for cities to really provide guidance around that operating platform. My streets are his operating platform for his technology, and so how do we really work on that together?
Yeah, this is great. So you're getting a sense now of, I think we've had a group here the past few days of real thought leaders and action leaders. Thanks to both of you for putting your initial thoughts together here. I think what Brad touched on of the elderly population and mobility challenged, reaching that threshold of population over 75 that might double in the next 30 or so years. And so what are we doing to address that challenge, to what Karina is working on the ground, and really bringing data and setting up approaches and pilots and methodologies that work for Pittsburgh and their people. And so I'll try to move us now from quickly discussing some of the problems to now, can we get to some of the solutions? And so I can't claim ownership over this revolutions concept. I've heard of urban transitions and transformations. My uncle wrote this initial piece on the 3 revolutions, and I think where we've talked about what revolution means, I think it really touches that human, that social aspect of communities coming together. And so I really think we're not as much technology focused, and if all our problems were technical, we might have solved them by now. There's much more of an institutional aspect to this. So really getting a back and forth between you in terms of the private sector or auto company perspective and the city. I'm going to ask Brad sort of or let's start with Karina. What cities are hoping to accomplish on pilots with companies, and what makes a company or even a research team ideal to work with? And then for Brad, sort of the inverse, what companies are hoping to accomplish with pilots in cities, and what makes for an ideal city to work in?
So some of the things that we would like to see is that we do have, as Brad indicated, we do have areas of the city where mobility choices are more limited. The bus may only come once every 30 minutes to take you where you want to go. In Pittsburgh, it's likely that there's a 20% grade for you to get from where you are now to where you want to go. So bicycling, maybe for some, but for me, I'm taking that downhill. So there's limitations in how people can get there. We also have a tremendous number of unbanked residents in our city, residents for whom using electronic forms of payment, while they might have a smartphone and they may even have access to data to use it, methods of payment that rely on preloading sums of money into an electronic form of payment is a challenge. And so some of the things that we really are looking at is how can we serve sort of these areas that are more mobility challenged? How can shared, eventually autonomous, preferably electric mobility be an option to serve those social needs? How can we keep costs low? We have a goal in Pittsburgh that across every income quintile in the city, that the combined cost of transportation, housing, and energy, which is actually expensive in the city of Pittsburgh, is maintained below 45% of household incomes. And so how can these different forms of mobility help serve that goal? We're looking at ways to really move toward higher occupancy shared mobility, so not just the traffic networking company with the driver and one passenger or perhaps 2, but how do we really go toward having multiple occupant vehicles? So looking at pilots for shared electric, preferably autonomous shuttle systems, and can they operate both on-road and in off-road areas. So we're really looking at how can these pilots help us solve some of these issues that we have, help fill the mobility gaps that exist in the city, and do it in a way that serves these greater social values that we have.
So probably a lot of you have seen Jurassic Park, that famous scene where the T-Rex is chasing the vehicle, and the mirror of the T-Rex's head, it says the objects in the rear are closer than they may seem. Actually, my message is the inverse of this is is true in this case. While everybody's really hyper-focused and excited about automation, we still have a lot of time. And we have a lot of time to work with cities, work with states, to really understand and sort of co-develop what the ground rules are for these technologies. And when we were talking earlier, she said, made the comment that she owns our operating system, which is true. But, we don't have to repeat the way that the car got introduced to this city at the beginning of after World War I, essentially. And between World War I and 1930s, there was a bloody battle over who had the primacy on the roads around the streets. And I think the most fundamental revolutionary part of the 3 revolutions, which we wholly believe in, the electric, shared, and AV future, is the ability and the need for cities, states, even the federal government, to work with industry to really understand where the technology stands, what's coming, and what's realistic, so that they don't invest in the wrong technologies or put in a lot of systems that end up being obsolete in 5 years. So that's why I say we have time, because the revolution is not at hand. We have time to do this the right way and think it through. I think that's a big opportunity for all of us.
All right, I'll pick up on that last thought. I think we have a way to shape this in a good direction. There's also some concerns of this potentially there being the utopia and dystopia. What in your view become, and I think you guys you were able to articulate the mutually beneficial relationship that is needed. And so from both of your perspectives, based on knowing the city, knowing the tech space, the infrastructure, what becomes obsolete? When we look back in 15, 20 years, what are we saying? Why did we make that decision? Or how quick do we need to start planning? When does this happen? And what are the impacts in a positive and negative direction in terms of what you anticipate?
So I'll start
Okay.
and then let you answer. I mean, for the city, this is a really crucial question because we only have so many capital dollars to invest every year. And we were talking in preparation for this panel about the fact that, we really only touch our streets once every 30 years, and we only rebuild them once every 70. So trying to project forward of what the world will look like in 30 and 70 years is a hard thing at this particular moment. So we really think a lot about, are we buying, beta or VHS? Because we're sort of, caught in this for the next several decades on the investments that we make. So, from our approach, what we're trying to do is really create a flexible platform, something that can be adapted. I don't know what if it's going to be 5G or if it's going to be Opera, if it's going to be something else that's going to be my communication system, but I do know it'll probably need conduit. And I can provide extra conduit to make sure that is able to be accommodated in my right-of-way without changing the street. And so I don't know if we're going to be able to get rid of those traffic lanes or get rid of the curbside parking, but I do know that the street rights-of-way that we have now are the same streets rights-of-way that we had 120 years ago. So I just need to make sure that I'm maintaining that network, maintaining that public space so that we have that flexibility going forward.
Yeah, the timeline question is a real serious one as we were talking about it. But, just before this, we were talking about AI. But if you looked at the auto industry's involvement in AI 3 to 5 years ago, you would have been laughed out of the room. It was the silly purview of video games. And now it's the single thing that could really focus the ability of self-driving cars to successfully navigate and safely navigate streets, because they're able to understand different environments faster. But it's important for us to be able to test in cities, knowing that we all understand individual timelines. Technology is changing every 6 to 12 months in this area. We typically build new car model platforms every 5 to 7 years. NHTSA, the federal government, writes federal safety standards every 10 years. And as you said, you tear up your streets maybe once every 30 years, if that. So, that's why we all have to be able to communicate and be in sync and understand what's realistic, what the needs are. Of course, we need to do testing in the streets of the city, because there's a lot of education of the systems to what the edge cases are. As we've seen some videos of people, what is their tendency to jump out of between a couple of parked cars and jaywalk? The systems need to safely know how to handle those kind of conditions. But it's also, so that's the easy part, the sort of part everybody gets. The other opportunity, though, is to understand how payment systems can be standardized so that a transit system is connected to a self-driving fleet that we may operate or another company may operate, so that somebody's not getting hit with premium charges, for the 2 or 3 different legs of the route they have to take. We don't think it's necessary that self-driving cars have to obliterate mass transit. It certainly won't for the heavier, bigger mass transit. It probably will affect what we know as the Uber and Lyft's ride-hailing now and taxi business. but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing if you don't like a lot of horns honking. So I think it's a way to look at how there's new opportunities that maybe we from the manufacturing and engineering side didn't necessarily see as clearly as what a city's on-the-ground experience tells us.
So I think there's a element of gaining confidence in the rate of disruption or what we've learned over time. And so I think Pittsburgh, we're excited to learn from your partnership with Uber and the automated vehicle pilot. Brad, I think we've had this sort of looking back, and I give the elevator example, you give the horse poop example, but what?
Horse poop usually gets more laughs.
So let's maybe hear a little bit about what was, what is, what could be, and I think maybe a more recent history for Pittsburgh, maybe that longer term perspective from Brad.
So, yeah, I mean, we know that surveys that have been done for consumers and what their sort of comfort level is with these robot cars, either operating alongside them or actually climbing in and taking one, and that across the country it seems that there is a fair degree of trepidation around this technology and worry that it will be hacked, it will be somehow it won't respond properly. But again, when we look at the statistics of how great we as human beings are doing in operating these vehicles, doesn't look good for us. We're not really performing well. In Pittsburgh, we've found that now that these are common elements on our streets, and most Pittsburghers have come in contact with one of them at some point or another over the past year or so that they've been operating. And it depends on who you are as to what your reaction to it is. If you're a pedestrian like me, if you're a bicyclist like some of our advocates, if you're a neighborhood resident, you love these cars and would like to see more and more of them out on the streets. Why? Because they always yield for pedestrians, and they always give bicyclists 4 feet of space, and they always travel the speed limit and don't speed through your neighborhood streets. If you're another driver, you curse them and you wish that there was a person there that you could give the finger to, because they're always going the speed limit and they're always stopping for those pedestrians. But we're finding that people, familiarity is breeding a higher level of comfort, and so I think other cities will experience very much the same thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Once you get, can you have a show of hands of anybody who's actually been in an automated vehicle in this room? Maybe fewer than 20, 10 maybe. It's pretty uncommon, and what I deal with almost every day is working with officials in state legislatures and members of Congress who also have never been in one of these cars, and yet they're passing legislation on something that they don't really know or understand. And it's strictly an education point of view, but familiarity, once you see it, we were the first to let non-engineers drive a long distance between Palo Alto and Las Vegas hands-free. And the headline that came out in Wired magazine was, "We've seen the future and it's boring." So if that's one thing I can leave with you, the future is pretty boring, but it's also pretty exhilarating too. We want it to be boring. We want it to be no drama, except when the car's going 55 and you're driving 70 right behind, trying to get behind it. But there's a lot of opportunity there, and this is a revolution that's not just being driven in the U.S. A lot of other countries are really organizing national efforts behind it. China, Japan, Great Britain, Sweden, to name a few, Singapore, very aggressively pushing this. So that's why we're confident that this is going to be a reality soon, because the world is pushing it along too. And I think that's why we need to work together now to sort of see what that means in America's streets and cities.
We could probably keep going, and there's lots more questions I'm sure the audience has, and I think we'll probably continue the discussion over the years ahead. I appreciate both of your time and look forward to how we all work together and coordinate our efforts towards a better future for our cities. And it might vary by city type, and it might vary in terms of Cleveland versus Pittsburgh, or both of you having experience in DC, understand the national perspective to how much I've talked with Brad about states are really taking different approaches here. And so I think there's a lot of learning that'll that'll still happen. So thank you again.
I know we're over time. There's just one more thing I wanted to say. Not every city's going to be alike. And to what Karina said, figure out what problem you want to solve and see how this technology can help solve it. New York's going to be radically different than the challenges in LA or Pittsburgh or Detroit. We were talking about Detroit yesterday, or a couple days ago now, I guess. But you know, every city's going to have a different dilemma and different situation that they want to solve. And this is a tool. It's a key into the lock. It's not the key lock and door to the future. So let's think about how we can maximize its use.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone.